Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. This is the podcast that delves into the intricate world of global politics, the past and present, while also exploring potential possibilities for what tomorrow could bring. I'm your host, Dylan. In each episode here of the Geopolitics Explained podcast, we'll break down complex issues into small, understandable chunks through in-depth scenario analysis. So come and join us as we navigate the ever-changing landscape of international relations, uncovering the stories behind the headlines and predicting trends that could shape the future of our world. Today, we're going to conclude my series on Israel with part 3, in which we're going to explore future scenarios of the current conflict between Israel and Hamas and the historical conflict between Israel and Palestine. Currently, we're seeing international attitudes towards Israel sour based on their continued assault of the Gaza Strip. This especially worsened when Israel commenced their operation into Rafah against the requests of many other nations. As a result, we're seeing some countries, such as the Turkish, pausing exports to Israel of key materials. We're also seeing other countries pausing weapons, such as the Netherlands and Canada. And we're seeing other nations wishing to join South Africa's genocide case in the International Court of Justice, as Egypt and Spain have expressed interest in doing. So there's a lot still happening in this conflict. Today, I'm going to explore the future scenarios for this conflict based on what all the parties within this conflict want. So we're going to look at what incentives Israel, Hamas, and Palestine have in regard to this conflict. So firstly, we'll start with Israel. What does Israel want to achieve from this conflict and any of the conflicts that we've seen between Israel and Palestine in the past? Israel wants to feel secure. Now, we know this from when Israel and Egypt were fighting, which commenced in the Six-Day War in 1967 and saw Israel annex the Sinai Peninsula. They kept the Sinai Peninsula because it gave them a buffer zone between their own borders and the borders of Egypt, and ensured that any attack that Egypt wanted to put on Israel would likely be seen from quite a distance away. It's for this reason that once this war is over, Israel will want some guarantees that it will be kept secure. One such way that they seem to be doing this is, as many have stated, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that Hamas cannot be allowed to continue ruling in the Gaza Strip. We've also seen the US's Antony Blinken state this, that Hamas will not be allowed to continue to rule in the Gaza Strip. The question then becomes, if Hamas isn't ruling in the Gaza Strip after this conflict, which cannot happen, what takes its place? Now, we've recently seen Joe Biden release a peace plan. It's stated in this also that Hamas would not be able to continue to rule in the Gaza Strip. But outside of that, the plan goes as follows. Firstly, we would see a 6-week ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas that would also see some of the hostages exchanged for some Palestinian prisoners. Secondly, and this is the point of the peace plan that I see problems with, there would be a permanent end to the fight negotiated between Israel and Hamas. Now, this comes to the incentives of Hamas and why it continues to fight. It's because Hamas wants to stay in power. So why would Hamas agree to this peace plan to end the fight if it completely goes against them being able to stay in power in the Gaza Strip? The third point of the peace plan proposed by Joe Biden would be a permanent ceasefire and a rebuilding of the Gaza Strip. Now, how could we go from Hamas being so heavily involved in these negotiations to end the current conflict and a permanent ceasefire for Hamas to then just step aside? That's not going to happen. And as many leaders from Israel have stated, their aim is to completely remove Hamas from power and existence. If Hamas still exists at the end of this conflict and is part of the negotiations, Israel isn't going to feel secure, which is one of its key non-negotiables it would want from the end of this conflict. This also brings us to an interesting point. That point is that we actually need to distinguish between what Israel wants and what Benjamin Netanyahu wants. Benjamin Netanyahu cannot accept Biden's peace plan, but it's for personal reasons and incentives. Now, if Netanyahu was to accept this peace plan, the Israeli Defense Minister, Ben-Gvir, and his party Jewish Power have stated that they will dissolve government. This would mean that Netanyahu would likely face the corruption charges for the trial that is still currently ongoing, so is incentivised to delay this as long as possible personally, and that means that the war, in some capacity, has to continue for Netanyahu. Personally, for Netanyahu, we've seen his governments over the decades move further and further to the right. If he wants to stay in power, he's now limited, as he has to appease these groups on the far right to remain in power. These political groups on the far right typically support no Palestinian state and the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, both of which are key issues in this historic conflict between Israel and Palestine, and are two of the issues that, if the conflict between Israel and Palestine is going to be solved going forward, need to be addressed in some capacity. With current Israel domestic politics, these issues won't be solved. That implies something needs to change, but that's not going to happen currently. We've also seen Israel's war cabinet recently dissolve when Benny Gantz and Eisenkot decided to pull out of the cabinet due to a lack of a plan for the Gaza Strip after the end of the conflict. This is what Gantz stated himself. Gantz did have a plan that the Gaza Strip after would see Israeli forces withdrawn and an international civilian government mechanism would be set up with many global nations involved that would help rebuild the Gaza Strip and establish a certain level of stability there. This would likely involve the Palestinian Authority, which has recently, earlier this year, undergone a revamp. This is another point that Netanyahu states he won't allow to happen. He doesn't want the Palestinian Authority ruling in the Gaza Strip. If Netanyahu sees Israel continuing to be present in the Gaza Strip and controlling the necessities that go into the Gaza Strip, which, as we've discussed before, turns the Gaza Strip into the biggest open-air prison in the world, then this goes against the incentives of the Palestinian people. What the Palestinian people want is the right to a better future. This starts by them being able to control access to their own necessities. This means they need their own leadership structure. We've even recently seen tensions rising between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden. In the eyes of Netanyahu, we've got the US election later this year, which is pitting Biden against Trump. When Trump was last in power in the US, we saw Trump's peace proposal for the conflict between Israel and Palestine, which heavily favoured Israel. The plan that Trump proposed saw Israel maintain control of many of the settlements that it has illegally expanded into in the West Bank, and the plan also saw Israel control the entire city of Jerusalem. This was clearly favoured towards the Israeli side, and in the eyes of Netanyahu, whose attitudes towards the Israel-Palestine conflict have grown more and more extreme over the years, he's likely going to get along better with a Trump administration than he is a Biden administration, so it might just be a waiting game for Netanyahu until November. Regarding the United States, they are currently embroiled in a balancing act. There were many nations internationally who were putting pressure on the US and their unwavering support for Israel, and we have seen that support slightly waver. However, Iran lurks to the east. If the US stops supporting Israel too much, Iran could smell weakness and make certain moves. So the US has to remain present in its support for Israel. It's just the international outcry from many nations is leading to questions being asked of the United States and their support for Israel. Now, this is relevant because Israel has really only ever listened to the United States, and if anything is to change, a more powerful nation needs to step in and change it. That's only going to be the United States. But even recently, as we've seen with the Biden-Netanyahu disagreements, it's questionable if Israel would even listen to the United States. And that's a dangerous position to be in. So the key question from all of this is, where are we going now and into the future? Now, as Netanyahu has stated, we know that Israel won't stop until Hamas is removed from power in the Gaza Strip. One question that immediately emerges for me is removal of Hamas even possible? We've recently seen Hamas re-emerge in the West Bank, and we've also seen the conflict resume in the north of the Gaza Strip. The tunnel system that Hamas possesses is clearly elaborate, and limiting the use of these tunnels for Hamas isn't going to be an easy job. So my view is that Hamas cannot be completely removed from existence. The war on terror took years, and as we saw in Afghanistan, it was actually the withdrawal of the United States that led to the Taliban returning to power. Again, it ties into military-industrial complex and companies making money from wars, which is going to continue. Is happening in Syria now. It's still happening in Yemen. So Hamas, in my eyes, can't be removed completely, but they can be removed from power. However, if Hamas is removed from power in the Gaza Strip, which it needs to be, the question then comes to what replaces Hamas. The US recently displayed support for the Palestinian Authority's revamp, but as I've stated, Netanyahu remains in power in Israel and he says no Palestinian Authority. So something has to give. The only way something gives here is if a more powerful force steps up and changes the direction that this situation is heading in. In my eyes, that can only be the United States. Now, how this happens, I don't know. Maybe pressure from Benny Gantz could see Netanyahu removed and the Palestinian Authority established to rule in the Gaza Strip. But Netanyahu isn't incentivized to give up power. As we've said, he's actually incentivized to continue the war. Israel generally could be incentivized and pressured by the United States due to the normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would give it economic boosts and would also further deter Iran from attempting to make moves against Israel in the Middle East. But Netanyahu himself isn't incentivized. After Hamas has been removed from power, and if the Palestinian Authority is given power in Gaza, then a rebuild would need to occur. This would need to be an international effort, as stated by Benny Gantz and his plan for Gaza after the end of the conflict. Hamas would be so weakened and they would no longer be in power in the Gaza Strip that relaunching any attack on the scale of October 7th would be low possibility. This would provide Israel with a certain level of security, but if this wasn't enough, a buffer zone between the border of Israel and Gaza could also help Israel feel more secure. However, who controlled this zone would be of vital importance. As we've seen in the past, if Israel is to control this zone, then Israel controls the flow of aid and necessities into the Gaza Strip, and this is part of the problem. This is what leads the Palestinians to have no vision of a future that could be better for them. So if a demilitarized zone is to be established, or if Palestine itself is to be demilitarized, then this needs to be enacted and controlled by an international organisation, maybe UN peacekeepers, or a coalition of many states from around the world. From there, I believe this could set a base layer upon which a more promising future for Palestine could be established. This is vital to even get both sides sat at the negotiating table, which should be the key aim of all of this, of any stopping of the conflict. The long-term aim should be to get both sides sat at the table. As we saw at the end of the 1970s with the Camp David summit, we saw Israel and Egypt reach a level of peace, which has held ever since then. This wasn't an easy situation to navigate, with President Jimmy Carter enacting what is known as shuttle diplomacy. Both the Israeli delegations and the Egyptian delegation were split, and Carter worked wholeheartedly on this issue, communicating back and forth between the sides to distinguish what they could agree on and what foundations could be laid so that moving forward a peace could be established. This worked wonders, proven by the fact that we continue to see Israel and Egypt peace today. The issue between Israel and Palestine, the historic conflict, needs this same level of focus and effort, and because of how deep-rooted it is, that requires a international coalition of efforts, especially from nations who are involved in the blame of this conflict existing in the first place. Now, as I stated earlier, for the United States, the main aim of this was to establish Arab-Israeli normalization further, with a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, Israel itself is incentivized to do this. The economic benefits they'd get from trade with Saudi Arabia and vice versa. The access to energy, potentially, from Saudi Arabia. Israel could benefit greatly from this normalization. Even as a general trend, as I discussed earlier, Israel is incentivized to normalize relations with states in the Middle East even more, because that would deter Iran from making any moves against Israel. Saudi Arabia has conditioned that normalization with Israel would occur after the establishment of a Palestinian state. We just need to be in the situation to start on that path, and with Netanyahu, for his own personal incentive, currently wanting this war to continue, we're not going to get there until that changes. Now, once the negotiating table is reached, which I'm not saying is going to occur soon, but it should be the aim of any efforts in ending this conflict, and that should be the long-term aim, to seek to establish a better future for Palestine and to establish a state. However, even once we get both sides to the table, there are still some key issues that need to be managed. Firstly, we have the issue of the status of Jerusalem. Now, Israel wants a united Jerusalem as its capital. Palestine wants East Jerusalem as its capital. Some have suggested giving the city of Jerusalem special religious status and uniting it. But how this would work, I'm not sure. Either way, it is an issue that would need addressing. Secondly is the status of the Israeli settlements that are being expanded in the West Bank. If this territory is given to Palestine, where would the Israelis go? And if the Israelis keep this territory, then what happens to a split West Bank that is ruled by Palestine? Final cycle that I believe needs to break is taking a long-term view towards this. Joe Biden would love to end this war and achieve Saudi normalization because it would boost his election chances in November. As we've said, Netanyahu would likely prefer Trump, and so Biden's running out of time, but he could still start this process off by pressuring Israel now. This isn't something that we're seeing too strongly, and as we said, it has to be balanced due to the existence of Iran to the east. But this process seems very stop-start currently. It's hard to distinguish where the US really stands, especially with its attitudes to Israel, and I know that's because it's trying to balance how it approaches it. But by taking a long-term view, Biden could start this process that could be finished later. Unfortunately, if Trump does get in power in November, I don't think that's what would occur with Trump and his ideas to end the Israel-Palestine conflict, clearly preferring the side of the Israelis. Now, in finishing this series on Israel, we've recently been looking at the conflict between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Palestine, which involves the Gaza Strip especially, and also the West Bank. But we now need to look to the north. In the last few days, Benjamin Netanyahu has stated that the assault on Rafah will soon be coming to an end. But as we've also discussed, to remain in power, Netanyahu needs a war. I believe this is why Israel is prepping for an assault on Lebanon, specifically on Hezbollah. This has continued to escalate over recent weeks, and I think the one key question from escalating tensions between Israel and Hezbollah is, once this conflict does erupt, which I believe is almost inevitable at this point, we've seen Israel preparing for this war in the north against Hezbollah, and we've also seen US officials warn that Israel plans on making some assault on Lebanon and Hezbollah. The key question that emerges is Iran's role once this conflict restarts. Does Iran get dragged back into this? If they do get dragged back into this in an active role, how active will that role be? Now, we see Iran heavily support Hezbollah more than the rest of the proxy groups that Iran supports for two reasons. Firstly, Hezbollah is a majority Shia Muslim group, which is the same as Iran culturally. And so they're more aligned with Hezbollah as a Shia proxy group than groups like Hamas that are a Sunni Muslim majority group. Now, Israel supports Hamas because they attack Israel, who is Iran's enemy. But if the operation of Hezbollah in Lebanon is affected, how Iran gets involved is certainly a key question to ask. The second issue is that Iran has a land bridge of influence throughout the Middle East, spanning through Iraq, Syria, and into Lebanon. This gives them access to the Mediterranean. If they lose Lebanon within their Middle Eastern sphere of influence, they lose access to the Mediterranean, and this is going to weaken Iran in the Middle East, which is going to be something that they're not going to want. Again, this is another reason for Iran's potential involvement once an Israel-Hezbollah conflict erupts. Now, to conclude, I for one hope that we can establish some level of peace where Hamas is removed from power and the future of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is determined by the Palestinian people. When I wrote my initial series on the Israel-Palestine conflict and this Israel-Hamas conflict back between October and December in 2023, in my concluding piece, I discussed that establishing an environment where Israel and Palestine both feel that they can approach the negotiating table could take decades. Israel's assault on Gaza currently has the potential to create a new Hamas. If you have the population in the Gaza Strip, a large proportion of which is children and young adults who are taught in schools to cultivate a hatred for Israel, then this isn't going to disappear overnight. But to build a lasting peace one day in the future, we have to start laying the foundations now. This has been another episode of the Geopolitics Explained podcast. I want to thank you all for listening. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a review on the podcast platform of your choice? And if you want more content like this, we write over on Substack. You can find the link for this in the description. Once again, I've been Dylan. Until next time, signing off.